Today, we've got something that reads like a spy novel. High stakes, secret operations. But here's the twist. The author insists it's his real life story. We are diving deep into the new confessions of an economic hitman, How America Really Took Over the World by John Perkins. And yeah, Perkins claims he was an EHM.
And our mission here, again, is to pull out those key nuggets of insight from Perkins' account. It's personal, sometimes pretty shocking stuff. He talks about this thing he calls the corporatocracy, basically a huge network of corporations, big banks, governments all working together. And he argues they've systematically grown their power across the globe. It affects developing nations, obviously, but also, and we'll get into this, the U.S. itself. He introduces this concept of a death economy, which sounds intense, and the tools they use to build it and maintain it.
And when the first version, the original Confessions, came out, it hit a nerve. The media definitely noticed. I remember the New York Times pointed out how it tapped into a larger vein of discontent and mistrust that Americans feel toward the ties that bind together corporations, large lending institutions, and the government. It really gave people a way to talk about this feeling that maybe there were unseen forces pulling strings behind the scenes. Okay, let's get into it then. This term, economic hitman, it sounds, well, cinematic. How does someone like John Perkins, who actually starts out in the Peace Corps, how does he even end up becoming one? I mean, that's not your standard career trajectory, is it?
No, definitely not. And that's kind of what makes his stories compelling. So he finishes business school in '68. Turbulent times. He and his wife, Ann, they joined the Peace Corps. Partly, he says, to avoid the Vietnam draft, which a lot of people were doing. They end up in Quito, Ecuador, way out in the Amazon, the Andes. Let's talk about a different world. And ironically, that very environment, hostile, challenging, it became this weird training ground for what came next.
So he's there, young guy, probably idealistic, doing Peace Corps work. When does the penny drop? When does he first get a look behind the curtain at this darker system he talks about?
Yeah, the first real eye-opener came during conversation he had in Quito. He meets this seismologist from Texaco. And the guy just casually lays it out, says organizations like USA, the World Bank, even the CIA, they weren't just doing aid work or intel. They were tools for corporate interests, specifically Texaco in that instance. And he even said governments that don't cooperate are seen as Soviet puppets. Just like that, matter of fact.
Wow. For a Peace Corps volunteer, that must have been jarring.
Yeah.
So the message was clear. You play ball or else. Destabilization, coups, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Perkins calls that dinner the beginning of his education into the whole EHM system. He started seeing it wasn't just one thing. It was like a whole toolkit. False economics, promises they never meant to keep, threats, bribes, extortion, and debt. Debt was huge. If that didn't work, then deception, coups, assassinations, or just straight up military force. It was a really comprehensive strategy for, economic control.
Okay, so after the Peace Corps, he gets recruited by this company, Charity Maine, Inc. Maine. And there's this connection, right? Ann's father's friend at the NSA, Uncle Frank, helped get him a draft deferment, paved the way to Maine. How did that work?
Yeah, that's a really interesting detail. Shows you the connections. Uncle Frank was high up at the NSA. His intervention definitely helped. Then Perkins gets formally recruited by a guy named Einar Grave. Grave was a VP at Maine, but also, get this, a U.S. Army Reserve colonel. And he specifically wanted Perkins because he seemed willing to stick his neck out. He survived those hostile environments in Ecuador, and he could produce economic forecasts. So his time in the Peace Corps, it wasn't just seen as volunteer work. It was like a test run.
Okay, and this is where it gets really wild. The secret training, this woman, Claudine, what did she tell him the job really was? No sugarcoating.
Right, Claudine. Perkins describes her as very sharp, sophisticated, basically his handler. And she laid it bare. She told him, quote, "My assignment was to mold me into an economic hitman." Simple as that. Her definition. We're well paid to cheat countries around the globe out of billions of dollars. She said their main job was to encourage world leaders to become part of a vast network that promotes U.S. commercial interests. And the key was trapping their countries in massive debt. That debt guaranteed loyalty, made them dependent. Almost impossible to escape.
That is quite something, especially for someone who started in the Peace Corps. So, okay, he's trained, he's molded. How did it work day to day? What was one of his first big assignment?
His first major gig was in Indonesia, developing a master plan for electrifying Java. Sounds good, right?
Yeah.
Development project.
Sounds like progress.
But the real mission, Perkins says, wasn't universal electricity for the people. It was about power for the oil industry, for other U.S. companies, for the military, building infrastructure that served their needs.
And he mentions this pressure to create very optimistic forecasts. That sounds like cooking the books, basically. What happened if someone pushed back, tried to be realistic?
Oh, yeah, huge pressure. And it shows the dishonesty at the core of it. His boss, Charlie, wanted these crazy high projections. Perkins talks about a colleague, Howard Parker, who seemed like a straight shooter. Parker submitted a realistic forecast, like 8% growth.
Yeah.
Fired, just like that. For being honest, Perkins learned fast. He gave them the inflated numbers they wanted for Java 17, 20% growth. And what happens? He gets praised, promoted. The whole mechanism was just insidious. They give these huge loans to countries like Indonesia. But, and this is key, the condition was that U.S. engineering and construction firms had to build the project.
So the money never really left the U.S.
Exactly. It just went from U.S. banks to U.S. corporations. But the country, they owed the full amount, plus interest. Eventually, they'd default, couldn't pay. Then the U.S. had leverage, control over resources, UN votes, maybe landing rights for military bases. It was debt for control, plain and simple.
That whole loan mechanism, tying it to U.S. companies, creating debt traps, it really paints a picture of that death economy he talks about. But you have to wonder, how could a country, especially a developing one, push back against something so, systematic, if they even knew what was happening?
It was incredibly difficult. Once you're in that debt trap, you're stuck. But sometimes leaders did understand. They tried to resist, which brings us to people like Omar Torrijos in Panama, people who didn't play the game.
And Perkins is incredibly blunt about them. He writes about Jaime Roldos of Ecuador and Omar Torrijos of Panama. Both died in fiery crashes. He states point blank their deaths were not accidental. He says they were assassinated because they opposed that fraternity of corporate, government, and banking heads whose goal is global empire. That is a massive claim.
It's a huge claim. And central to his story, he presents it as just how things worked. Torrijos was apparently very popular in Panama, charismatic leader, really fighting for Panamanian sovereignty, especially over the canal. He wasn't just anti-U.S., Perkins says. He was pro-Panama. He refused to let foreign interests dictate terms, refused personal gain from aid, wanted it for his people.
So he was a genuine threat to the system.
A profound threat, yeah, because he was actually empowering his own country. And when the EHMs, like Perkins, couldn't persuade or coerce leaders like Torrijos, that's when Perkins says the jackals came in.
The jackals.
CIA-sanctioned assassins, according to Perkins. The enforcers.
Chilling. The idea of jackals just waiting in the wings. But he also talks about other tactics, right? Like Saudi Arabia. That was different, wasn't it? Not about debt.
Right. The Saudi case was unique. This was after the 73 oil embargo, remember? Oil prices shot up. Saudi Arabia was suddenly swimming in cash, petrodollars. So the goal wasn't to indebt them. The goal was to get that money back into the U.S. economy, to recycle it. Perkins' job there, as he put it, was to apply as much creativity as I could to justifying the infusion of hundreds of millions of dollars into the Saudi Arabian economy by hiring U.S. firms to build everything, roads, power grids, entire cities, transforming the place, replacing, as he says, goats in Riyadh with modern infrastructure built by Americans.
So let me get this straight. The deal was Saudi Arabia invests its oil money in the U.S., buys U.S. Treasury bonds, things like that. And in exchange, Washington promises total and unequivocal U.S. political and, if necessary, military support to keep the House of Saud in power. It sounds like a quid pro quo ensuring U.S. economic stability and Saudi political stability, locking them together.
That's pretty much it. Perkins even quotes this cynical line used back then, calling Saudi Arabia the cow we can milk until the sun sets on our retirement. Yeah, it shows the long-term thinking, the generational plan for U.S. benefit. And Perkins connects this directly to later events. He argues this cozy relationship meant U.S. officials later felt compelled to look the other way regarding Saudi financing of groups involved in international terrorism, including, he says, Osama bin Laden's fighters in Afghanistan against the Soviets back in the 80s. It shows how these deals have really complex, often dangerous, long-term blowback.
Okay, Perkins paints this picture of the EHM system as this cancer that started overseas. What does he say about it now? Has it stayed overseas, or has it, like he implies, come home to the U.S.?
Oh, it's definitely come home, according to Perkins. He argues the whole EHM concept has metastasized, spread right into the U.S. economy. He talks about corporate executive EHMs operating inside all sorts of businesses now, not just international finance. Their goal is the same. Maximize profit, find the cheapest labor, the easiest resources, the biggest markets. And if that means abandoning a town, a community, leaving behind unemployment, so be it. They just move on.
He specifically mentions site location consultants as a domestic version, acting like legal bribery agents. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating example. These consultants work for big corporations looking to build a new factory or headquarters. Their job is basically to play states and cities off against each other. What tax breaks can you offer us? What subsidies? They extract these huge deals.
Yeah.
Perkins mentions Boeing getting an $8.7 billion tax break in Washington state. Think about that.
Billion, with a B.
Billion? That's money that could go to schools, roads, healthcare, but instead it goes to the corporation. Perkins calls it legal bribery because they use the leverage of potential jobs to demand corporate welfare, basically stealing from taxpayers to pad corporate profits.
And what about the banks? Modern banking scandals, these vulture funds, how do they fit this pattern?
Connecting back to the death economy idea, Perkins is scathing. He says some modern bankers acted like bandits and mafiosi, rigging currency prices like in the LIBOR scandal. And these vulture funds, they embody that debt as slavery idea. They buy up the defaulted debt of poor countries for pennies on the dollar. Then they sue aggressively, often for the full original amount, plus huge interest and fees.
So they profit massively off a country's desperation.
Hugely. It can cripple a nation's budget, preventing them from funding basic services. It's pure extraction, leveraging misery for profit.
And that revolving door we always hear about. Finance, government, back to finance. How does that keep the system going?
Perkins sees the revolving door as absolutely crucial for the corporatocracy. You have executives getting these massive payouts, golden parachutes, to leave their company and take a key government job. Then, once they're inside government, they help shape policies, regulations. Guess who benefits? The industry they just came from. It creates this feedback loop where policy favors the corporations, cementing their power, making it really hard to regulate them effectively from within.
So if the EHMs have adapted and are now working domestically, what about the jackals, the enforcers? Have they evolved too?
Perkins argues they have, very much so. Today's jackals wear many disguises, he says. The tools are different now. Drone assassinations, for instance, often with terrible collateral damage, killing civilians. Paramilitary forces, high-value target assassination programs. It's become more technologically advanced, maybe more detached, but still deadly, and often easier to deny.
And he makes this really worrying point. The tools honed overseas drones, mass surveillance are now used inside the U.S., sacrificing privacy and freedom right here.
Exactly. That's a huge concern he raises. Post 9/11, Americans gave agencies like the NSA huge surveillance powers. Now we have surveillance drones flying over U.S. cities, ostensibly for security. But it goes beyond that. He talks about character assassination, using modern eavesdropping tech to dig up dirt, ruin reputations, maybe even plant evidence, affecting politicians, activists. He even points to things like the monitoring around President Clinton's impeachment as an example of how information warfare can be used domestically, the tools of empire turned inward.
It's a pretty bleak picture, but Perkins himself went through a major change, didn't he? He talks about solutions moving away from this death economy. What caused his shift?
Yeah, he describes this growing sense of guilt, disillusionment, a real crisis of conscience. He says the U.S. invasion of Panama, and especially the 9/11 attacks, hit him hard. He felt complicit. He realized the true human cost of the system he'd been part of. And that's what finally pushed him to break his silence, write the book, expose it all.
And since then, he's been involved in work promoting indigenous wisdom, environmentalism, co-founding Dream Change, the Pachamama Alliance. So what is this life economy he talks about? How is it fundamentally different?
The death economy, right? It thrives on war, debt, exploiting resources until they're gone. Profit above all else. The life economy is the opposite. It's based on courage, love, sounds a bit cliche, but that's his framing. Environmental sustainability, social justice, regeneration, things like cleaning up pollution, helping communities feed themselves locally, building economies that don't destroy the planet for short-term gain. It's about well-being, community, long-term health, not just endless growth and individual wealth.
A very different model. But he also talks about these 4 pillars of modern empire that keep us locked into the current system. Can you break down maybe 1 or 2 of those, like fear? How does fear keep us stuck?
These pillars are the mechanisms holding up the death economy. He lists them as fear, debt, insufficiency, and the divide and conquer mindset. Let's take fear. The corporatocracy, he argues, constantly uses fear. Fear of terrorism, fear of economic collapse, fear of the other, even just fear of not having enough stuff.
Okay.
This fear justifies massive military spending, justifies surveillance, makes us anxious consumers. It distracts us from the real systemic problems and makes us accept policies that mainly benefit the powerful. It's a really potent control mechanism. And then insufficiency, this constant feeling that we don't have enough, that we need more, the next gadget, bigger house, whatever. It drives overconsumption, which fuels the whole death economy, traps us on this treadmill.
Yeah, you can really see how those operate almost unconsciously in daily life. So given all this, What does Perkins say we can actually do? How do we challenge these pillars and move towards that life economy?
He calls it a consciousness revolution. It starts with changing our own attitudes, our goals, replacing fear with courage, debt with generosity, aggression with nurturance. He says individual actions like recycling, they're good, but not enough. We need bigger shifts. He talks about taking appropriate daily action and, really importantly, committing to tell a new story, a different narrative about what success and progress look like. Practically, he suggests things like shopping and investing consciously, really looking at where your money goes, supporting ethical businesses, divesting from harmful ones,
Okay, makes sense.
living consciously, maybe downsizing, using less energy, getting more involved in your local community, building resilience right where you are, supporting causes, giving time or money to groups working for real change, speaking out, talking to people, sharing information, challenging the lies, getting out of debt, using cash, paying off credit cards, resisting that consumer trap, changing who our heroes are, celebrating people working for a better world, not just the rich and powerful. He even has specific advice. For retired folks, use your freedom to rattle the cage. For corporations, shift to long-term sustainability. For entrepreneurs, create genuinely different, life-affirming solutions. It's a call for everyone to get involved in building something new.
It's been quite a journey, this deep dive into the new confessions of an economic hitman. We've traced the EHM system, seen how Perkins claims it evolved and spread, and heard his call for this urgent shift to a life economy.
And Perkins leaves us with a pretty stark thought. He says quite bluntly, the only reason this system keeps going is because the rest of us give it permission to work. He says, at best, we look the other way. At worst, we actively support it. So, maybe the question for you listening right now is this. What permission are you ready to withdraw starting today?
Something definitely worth thinking about. We really encourage you to check out John Perkins's work for yourself, dig into the details, think about how you might contribute to this consciousness revolution he describes.